Emile has a fascinating history. He was a Korean war orphan, adopted into an African American family in South LA. He joined the Los Angeles Fire Department and rose to chief deputy, second in command. Being a visionary and innovative leader, he created the LAFD's 20-year strategic master plan. As the go-to person for challenging high-profile issues and making difficult change, his initiatives changed the LAFD's culture that had been plagued by inequity, hostile work environments, and multi-million-dollar litigation. Emile works tirelessly in the community. He's the executive VP of the Korean American Federation of Los Angeles, representing the Korean community. He chairs the Mixed Roots Foundation, raising awareness and funding for the adoption and foster care community. He is on the boards of the Biddy Mason Foundation, the First AME Church of Los Angeles, supporting foster youth, and Music Miracles that brings music to disadvantaged children. He's a community leader who best embodies the spirit and determination of Los Angeles. In this podcast, he explains the current Black Lives Matter protests, placing them in a larger context by showing how things have changed and haven't since the 1965 riots. He also discusses his personal experience as a firefighter during the 1992 riots, or civil unrest, depending on who you ask. He takes us through America's history to explain how we got to where we are today and addresses the question of police brutality and how we can reform the system through leadership, policy, and changing people's mentalities. We hope you enjoy.
I take people back to 1865, the end of the Civil War. Slavery is abolished and the African Americans have freedom. But 100 years goes by, and it's not until 1965, through much protest and civil actions, that then the Civil Rights Amendment is produced, which now gives African Americans and other people of color, as well as women, equal status under the law. That took 100 years from the time, and some people may not really catch that the end of the Civil War wasn't the end of the issue. Slaves were free, but they didn't have equality. So 1965, they get equality, as do other people. Now we go forward to 1992 and to today, 2020, and we're having civil unrest. And what is making that? And the African American community feels that its lives are not equal to that of, as we all compare, the Caucasian race. So what sparked the 1965 riots? Injustice, inequality, civil rights. What sparked the 1992 riots was African Americans didn't feel that they had a life that was equal to those of the Caucasians. And again, in 2020, the feeling is the same as you are hearing from them. Our lives are not equal to the Caucasian. And so we've gone from freedom, attaining freedom, 1865, to getting equal rights under the law in 65, but yet we don't have equality of life. And I don't mean, deadly force and violence and, the PD issue, but quality of living that is on a par, as comparisons are made between the people of color communities, the African American community and the Caucasian community. So that is what is now producing these upheavals. And until we can address the issue of my life feels equal in education and opportunity and all the things that touch our lives, then they will still feel that they're being discriminated against, inequality, racism, etc., because of this inequality of living. I was just at the First AME Church yesterday, and we had Mayor Garcetti, we had Chief Moore and Chief Villanueva from the sheriffs, and leaders from the African American community. We had Nation of Islam represented, representatives speaking on behalf of Black Lives Matter, and clergy and others from the community. And you could hear this common thread repeated over and over, that there, and these are my terms, equality of living, but that sentiment that there is this inequality. So what I told them when I spoke is, I represent the Korean American Federation, and that was partly my reason for being at the First AME yesterday. And I expressed that I'm here because following the 1992 riots, we felt we have to build a relationship and a bridge, a friendship with the African American community and other communities, because of the very fact we knew things for the African American community have not changed since 65, 92, and here again 2020. And we knew it was going to erupt again. So we wanted to ensure that we were speaking to the other communities so that when this did occur again, we would be in direct contact. We could help resolve issues quickly between the communities so that we didn't get enveloped and have the issues between the different ethnicities that occurred in 1992. Because of the fact we knew things hadn't changed for the African American community, and that this was going to occur again, which obviously we see has occurred again. And the African American community is saying the same thing. They don't have this equality that they feel should be for all people.
Yeah, that's great. So let me, it's a very helpful sort of framing narrative. Let me ask you a couple of specific questions. One is that both in 65 and in 92, and again in 2020, the civil action unrest that we've seen, in each case, the immediate spark that led to the clashes and in many cases violence,
right,
was police,
right,
was police violence. And what I'm hearing from you is that while things in some ways have gotten better for some parts of the African American community, that particular problem has not gotten better.
Right.
So the two questions for me follow from that. One is, why hasn't it gotten better? So that's the first one I want to ask you. And then the second one I want to ask you is, I'm struck, I grew up in Los Angeles in the 1970s and 80s, and I have to say that when the Rodney King riots broke out in Los Angeles, I was not surprised that this kind of thing would have happened in Los Angeles. The level of intracommunal hostility in the city in the 1970s and 80s and into the early 90s was really high. And the particular way in which the Rodney King riots unfolded in Los Angeles really reflected that, right? I mean, you know, obviously there was a lot of violence and burning of stores in Koreatown.
Right.
We all remember the horrible images of things happening in South Central, with the truck driver being attacked and so on. This time around in 2020, it's been very, very different. The geography of protest has been really, really different, right? There's been marching downtown. There's been stuff going on in Santa Monica and Beverly Hills. But actually, you know, in Koreatown and in South Central and South Los Angeles, there's been, you know, relative calm.
Right.
And I'd be interested in your reflections on why that geography has changed. And it sounds to me like part of it is exactly the interventions that you've been spearheading over these last, some 30 years.
Yeah. So you asked me earlier about kind of where I was. So after I was adopted from Korea and brought here and was raised by an African American family right on Jefferson and 8th Avenue, one of my early childhood memories was tanks, military tanks, going down our street. And obviously at the time, I didn't quite fathom truly the significance of the event, but obviously later it obviously is very unsettling that we had that type of presence here in Los Angeles. During the 1992 riots, I worked for the Los Angeles City Fire Department, and I was a officer, and I was called in the night of when the civil unrest began. And for 3 days, we were on the line. And for me, I began in South Central Los Angeles at the MTA bus yard where everyone was gathered. And from there, I followed the path of violence and destruction from South Los Angeles into downtown and then west. And my engine company, myself and 3 other firefighters, were dispatched by ourselves to a structure fire at 8th and Vermont. So we were the first engine company to come into Koreatown. And when we arrived there, we had a store on fire, and we pulled up to a hydrant across the street to hook up our hose so we could get water. And at that time, I saw 2 Chevys, Impalas, driving down the street southbound toward us. And it was very out of place because the streets were fairly deserted at that time. And I watched them, and they pulled up right to the corner where we were. 8 men got out of their cars and drew pistols and began shooting into the stores right behind us.
Wow.
We hit the ground. Within seconds, Korean shop owners came out of those stores under fire, lined up in front of their stores, and began shooting back. The intensity of the 92 unrest was far different than the 2020. And kind of going to what you said, there was such anger in the air in 1992 that it was unleashed wherever people were. There was no organized protest. There wasn't, let's organize here and march there. It was just spontaneous anger that erupted wherever people were, and that's why you had what you described, and at that time called South Central, in Koreatown, because within the hour that we were fighting that fire on 8th and Vermont, every block between us and going south to Santa Monica Freeway went up in flames at 5-minute intervals. And it was just amazing to watch. And by the time an hour was over, there was nothing but a blanket of smoke covering Vermont from where we were as far as we could see. And so, as you had said, there was quite a difference. It was erupted at whatever point people were at. And that's why it started in central Los Angeles and then began to move. And as we went into downtown, it was a little bit different because we went there this following morning and it was the massive looting. And if you're familiar with Washington Boulevard, when we turned onto Washington Boulevard at the south end of downtown, the street was a carpet of people. It just looked like these undulating heads that you could walk for a mile down Washington Boulevard on undulating heads, running back and forth, doing all types of things. And, you know, and I describe it to some people. Some people were just angry. Some people just stood there. Other people just had wild looks in their eyes that you can't imagine.
Mm.
And it, and that, you know, this isn't who they are on a regular day. And so it was very unsettling to see people in such state of frenzy.
Mm.
But there weren't as many fires. It was more the looting in downtown. When we were then sent into Koreatown, as I was telling you earlier, then the fires began again,
Mm.
and fires on a large scale, because now the anger, the different community issues, you know, long-standing community issues came into play. So I saw differences in where widespread fires were set versus more looting. Looting occurred everywhere, but you know, I saw that difference. The other thing that I people will sometimes say, but I try to give it some measure for them. They say, why do people call it? Some people call it the riots, and some people call it the unrest. If you're an African American, you call it the unrest because it's just you're so tired of your condition and what you've been put through that it's you in revolt, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you know, and others will say, well, not everyone's saying, well, of course, but the general feeling is of we've been discriminated against so long and lived in this condition so long that we're tired of it. That's why they refer to it as civil unrest. You go to people outside the African American community, Caucasian or other people that aren't directly affected, they'll call it a riot because it simply looked like pandemonium just broke out, and it has no meaning to that. The African American people feel that they've just been so mistreated for so long that this is their unleashing, where others will say they're just gone bonkers, you know, and then they'll refer to it as a riot. So you have to have somewhat that sensitivity when you're talking to different groups because they will be sensitive to those words. You know, you say riot to an African American, they'll kind of look at you, as well as to a Korean that went through the 1992 riots, and you say unrest to them, they're going like, no, that was a riot. It was bonkers. You know, so different frames of reference there, and then kind of getting back to your original question. So 92 things just happened where people were just upset and they unleashed where it happened, where they were. And so that's why you had the widespread happening in their own African American community, the issues between the African Americans and the Koreans, and it spread it into Koreatown, and you know, and then widespread beyond that. But that's why you got that geographic distribution. Obviously, in 2020, a nation saw a very appalling act on media, and you didn't have to be black to understand that wasn't right, you know. And so everyone realized, or you know, everyone could see that isn't right, and felt the need to do something. And so we had more a cause driven response from the nation that then had these outcroppings of, you know, looting and this and that, but the overall emphasis of the events was because people were cause driven, that they saw something unjust and they felt it needed to be rectified. That's why we have what we had in the 2020 here in Los Angeles. It wasn't in the African American community. The protests weren't centered there because a lot of the protesters were Caucasian or of other races. So they went to, you know, places like City Hall and what would be considered Caucasian areas, and made their protests. So that's why we had the geographic huge difference from 92 to 2020.
Yeah, that's a great outline of the sort of spatial dynamics of this. In 1992, what sparked the unrest or the riots, however you wish to frame it, was the acquittal of the police who were involved in the Rodney King beating. Obviously, there was not a Korean shop owner who was responsible for that, right?
Right.
Whatever you make of the verdict, and yet it spilled into this kind of intracommunal violence.
Right.
In 2020. You have a worse incident of police violence. I mean, Rodney King survived what he went through, and obviously George Floyd did not.
Right.
There hasn't been a trial yet, but
Right.
We'll see, and God knows what will happen if these officers get acquitted. But this time, there's been much more of an expression of solidarity, I would say, in a way. I mean, while there has been some, sporadic incidents of looting and some violence, more in other cities than in Los Angeles, but there's been a much more intracommunal solidarity. So I don't think. Right. So I'm wondering what you think and why you think things have changed over the last 30 years, so that the oppressions that you're talking about that the African American communities face and the inequalities, the structural inequalities, those things are long-standing, right? As you pointed out, they go back to slavery and to the failure to complete the process of generating civic equality, not just legal equality, right? And yet this time, there's been much more cross-racial, cross-community, I would say, expressions of, as I say, solidarity maybe is too strong a word, but at least, you see multiracial groups out protesting together. What do you think has happened in Los Angeles and in the country as a whole? Obviously, you have direct experience in Los Angeles, to lead to a different outcome now than what we saw 30 years ago.
I think the difference between the two is the public's perception of the incidents. So in 92, they may not have seen Rodney King so much the victim as they saw with Floyd in 2020. So that's why you had cross-racial upheaval and indignation at what happened to Floyd in 2020 versus in 1992 with Rodney King. So one is the visual perception of and gut perception of the two incidents. The other thing that overlays all of this and kind of goes back to, because the condition of the African American community is what it is, and I've long said this, it just takes a trigger to ignite it. That this undercurrent is always there, and triggers are happening all the time, as you and I know. Here's a police shooting, excessive force, et cetera, and they keep happening. So the triggers are constantly happening, or the fuse, whatever you want to call it, with this underlying just feeling of discrimination, racism, and inequality that is just simmering all the time. And then it's just a matter of time that a trigger is going to unleash that underlying pent up frustration, anger. And it's funny, I said, we're going to have one of these every 25 years. And this was back toward 1992, because we saw that the underlying condition wasn't changing. But if you look at the date, 65 to 92 is 27 years. 92 to 20 is 28 years. And if I was a betting person, I would project out another 25 or so years and say, this is going to unleash, again, there's going to be some trigger. And the difference between 92 and 20, from just us, you and I talking about it, is the visual was different. But if we had one of the other cases that recently have occurred of police violence, and it wasn't as clear to everyone that was totally inappropriate use of force, that if it was another case, maybe the same cross-cultural support wouldn't be there.
Right.
Because it's seen differently as to who the victim was.
That's a little depressing, the idea that we're not making any progress and we just have to expect one of these conflagrations every 25 years, but you might be right. Let me just press you on that a little bit, though.
Mm-hmm.
It does seem to me, it's funny. So I said I grew up in LA in the 70s and 80s, and then I lived in Northern California mostly for the last 25 years. I went to college up north, and I stayed up there. And I came back to Los Angeles when I took this job at Begruin. And I live downtown near our offices there. And it's really struck me after growing up in LA in a really different time period and then being away for a long time, then coming back, how different communal relations feel now.
Right.
I don't know how much of that is just me being older or perceiving things differently, and it's hard to know. I mean, this is obviously not a scientific thing, but I do think that one reason why I think there's more solidarity with the BLM protests in the street now, I think you're right, is because this video of George Floyd was so egregious and, pardon the language, black and white in terms of sort of moral valence of it.
Right.
But I do think also, we're seeing a lot more violence happening in other cities than in Los Angeles right now in 2020, right? And I do think that things have improved. It seems to me, both in terms of my anecdotal experience and also comparatively, right? I mean, in 1992, the worst riots were in California, right? Now, granted, the incident in question took place here, obviously, so that was part of the story. But the worst violence took place in California, and then there were other cities that had sympathy riots and sympathy unrest, if you will. But the worst of it was here, whereas this time around, while things have been really intense, obviously, in Los Angeles, it's obviously nothing at all as severe as in 1992. So I don't know if you would agree. I mean, you're deeply involved in these community issues, whether you would agree that community relations have improved.
Yeah.
And if so, what has led to that improvement?
Yeah. Things have improved since 92. You could see there was quite a difference between what occurred here in Los Angeles this time than what's happening in other cities. Other cities look like us back in 92.
Exactly.
And we look comparatively quite different. People have been doing things to make things better. Everywhere from the police department to communities reaching out to each other. Because when the events first unfolded with Floyd, that day I was already calling First AME Church. I was already calling the Filipino SIPA organization and the Latino leaders and the Bangladesh and the others. One, to do a check-in, say, are you okay? How are things in your community? And then secondarily to say, if anything happens, let's talk.
Right.
So a great deal of that has been occurring with bridge building between the communities, also between the city and the communities. There have been obviously initiatives and efforts to connect City Hall and city government with the communities, as well as the police. And, I come from a fire department background, and I can speak that it's the same for LAPD, and LAPD even more so. LAPD is under such intense scrutiny, both from the public, but the media. And if LAPD sneezes, it's on the tube.
Right.
So they have gone through tremendous changes. We have typically had political bodies here that advocate for the public, and ensuring that people have their rights, but also treated appropriately. So that has made LAPD progressive more so than potentially other departments in other parts of the country. And the same was, I say, for the LAFD, because when institutional racism and discrimination were rampant in fire departments,
Mm-hmm.
LA Fire was one of the first to take it head on. And we changed a century-old culture of good old boy club and all of that other stuff that goes with that,
Mm-hmm.
and disparity, everything. Fortunately, here in Los Angeles and the West Coast, we are more inclined and to be more progressive than the rest of the nation. And I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just we end up for some reason starting here. Maybe because of our leadership, maybe because of who we are, we just seem to be progressing earlier than others. And I saw that with the fire department as we took on these challenges and changed our culture over 15 years ago. And I see that with LAPD, it was, in the early phases where it prohibited the chokehold, things that other departments are still doing.
Mm-hmm.
LAPD instituted policy changes to prevent its use of force issues that were arising, and also trying to address the culture of the officers within LAPD, which I'm going to just say unverified, but ahead of other police departments
Right.
through the nation.
Yeah.
So I see that as, to your question, the progressiveness that has been placed upon LAPD, the communities within the city that realize they need to reach out and work together and stay connected, and then city government that also is doing the same thing. So channels of communication were open. And it's not that it would have prevented a worse situation, but it definitely, as you're saying, it made this situation better than back in 1992.
Yeah. I have a I guess a hypothesis, you might say, about why this is. Back in the 1990s, the state and the city, or the Southland in general, was just on a tipping point racially, where the state was going from being a majority white state to a majority minority state.
Mm-hmm.
And, the last vestiges of, as you were putting it, a good old boy culture, particularly in the institutions, was very much still in place as a legacy of, longstanding white majorities, and the institutions that have been built on that basis. And now the state is, I haven't looked at the numbers recently, but it's like 37% white, and it's something similar Latino, and it's 14% Asian, and it's 13% Black, or whatever the numbers are, right? And the fact that there's no one group that has a majority status anymore, has sort of forced the politics of the state to become a little bit more inclusive rather than being able to sort of dominate. And I think that that's part of the story, right? One reason why I have some long-term hopes that things might get better in other parts of the country too is that as those same demographic transitions happen, people will make political accommodations the same way it's happened here in Los Angeles. Well, why don't I just start there and ask whether you agree with that kind of as a political assessment of part of what the underlying politics of this are.
Yeah. And I think that there's room for multiple influences, and partly what you described, because, as we know, when you look at affirmative action, numerically, there's tipping points. And people say once a population gets to a certain tipping point, they're now established and they're not in the same struggle for identity and recognition as those that are of lesser percentage. So definitely numbers matter, and that very well can be part of the equation that has tipped the change from 92 to 2020. And hopefully as we move forward, there'll be even more robust changes that occur that will continue that change that will hopefully keep something like this from happening again. But if it does happen, it'll be even lesser of the magnitude, algebraic from what we had in 65 and 92.
Right. So this gets to the last question I wanted to ask you, which is, you gave a slightly depressing narrative of these things happen every 25 or 28 years or whatever, right? 65 and 92, and now we're in 2020, and maybe we'll see another one in the mid 2040s or whatever. What do we need to do as a community, as a political community, as a set of institutions, governmental institutions, whether it's City Hall or the police department, community organizations?
Right.
Seems like things are moving in a somewhat better direction. That's part of why it's been less bad this time around than it was in 92.
Right.
And yet, what do we need to do to continue the momentum in your view, and maybe even make a breakthrough so that we don't have another thing happen in 25 years?
Right. Well, and we kind of look at the causative factors of what caused each of these unrests, and they've always been related to police action on African American, and the community's related issue of inequality. And until we can take care of one or both of those, we always stand the potential for this occurring again. And as you know, those are monumental issues, one, to break down into individual issues, which is almost simple. It's easy to say, well, we need to do something about employment. We need to do something about access to education. We need to do something about the family structure and quality of the family structure, role models in the community. It's easy we know the parts, but it's hard to actually create solutions to actually address those things. Mm-hmm. And that is going to be our challenges. We know what needs to be done, but how do we accomplish that? Mm-hmm. Because they are unbelievably complex societal issues, and who can step up to that plate and be able to address each of these issues that are so diffused into our society. Yeah. And then, so that's the one part, to address how do we create that equality of life, because that's the underlying simmering. Then the second is the police. And, police have progressively gotten better. Mm-hmm. And they have but we still obviously see they still have a ways to go, because police are human beings. Right. Human nature prevails unless people are, can go through a change that changes their behavior and the way they think, that they will be constantly tugged by human nature. So that's why it's so important with police organizations that they have a leader that is committed to change. Not because, the mayor just told me, you need to straighten out your department. Okay, I'll figure out the thing, because they're just going to figure out the things that need to be done. Right. But you need a leader that is committed, that this is what I want to do, because they will think and infuse that messaging in the organization, because a leader has to message. Right. And a leader has to have the people that are of like mind and principles carrying it out. And then, obviously review of policies, procedures, and putting in place procedures that takes the human nature element out of some of the, you can act at based on your judgment. Some things need to have processes that check you.
Right.
And so just like the chokehold and, banning that and this and that. So, then it's policies, procedures, and processes that help prevent the recurrence. And then the change that has to be given to the officers, that the department is changing, that, we have operated this way for centuries, but now we need, and we're in a new time, we need to change the way we think of how we police. And not so much cops and robbers, get the bad guy, or, whatever. I'm just, being figurative. But how do we change the way our officers think? And that comes through very intense training. And that's what we went through in the fire department. We had to actually change the way our people thought about equality, affirmative action, treating each other with respect, because you just don't tell someone to do it and they do it. It doesn't come from an order.
Well, what I love about what you're saying, Emile, is you just broke it down beautifully. Like, leadership is incredibly important. Like, you got to have the right kinds of leaders up top who are showing the way and are committed to change, and to equality. And then you've got to have the bureaucratic layer, the policies, procedures, et cetera, so that you institutionalize the change that the leadership wants. And then ultimately, the way in which that becomes, takes deep roots is by changing the mentals that people have. I saw something, the thing that was on everybody's, news feed yesterday was this incident in Buffalo. I don't know if you saw this. This 75-year-old white man, as it happened, came up to a line of police who were sort of trying to clear, I think, some square. And I think he was handing them, he'd found one of their helmets and he was handing it to them. And this cop came up and just shoved this old man over, and he fell over and cracked his skull open. It was sort of a terrible visual thing, right? And I just watching that, I just realized the way in which that one policeman in that one department, but it can't just be him, right? There's a structural issue where he just felt like, in this context, you just go up and shove somebody, right? And it just so happened that the poor man fell on his head. I'm sure he didn't want the man to fall on his head. That was not his intention when he pushed him. But the point is, he just felt like it was okay to just shove an old man.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I remember seeing that. And see, that's where the change in mind needs to be done with the rank and file. And that's what we had to do with our people. And, when we first looked at it, someone said, well, we can sign up for this training. We could sign up for that training. This consultant will come in. And I told them no, because change is not a one-time deal. Change has to be ongoing, continuous, because otherwise people, once the training's over, people will fall back. And if nothing's there to catch them, they'll fall back to where they were before.
That's right.
Because training is too often treated like a check off the box.
Totally.
We did sexual harassment training, check it off.
Right.
And we won't have any problems. And you and I both know the fallacy of that. So we ended up creating a partnership with the city's Human Relations Commission. We actually brought on their staff, and they developed a training program to address the human relations issues we had. But then it wasn't just a human relations training program. We also then had them, because we tell them, we want you to infuse your training into every training we have.
Right.
So even if guys are outside chopping on a roof, training, there's going to be some piece of question or something that's going to come up about how are we doing this fairly, equally, the human relations piece, because we wanted it everywhere, especially in our promotional courses and things like that. But we put it everywhere in our drill towers, because one of the interesting things about, and I'll give you a real quick story. After a firefighter enters our training academy, they go through a very rigorous training program, very rigorous. and and they're not always treated with kid gloves. And then they go on probation. And again, they may be exposed to less than kid glove behavior. But the interesting thing we found out through this human relations group was the biggest offenders of harassing probationary firefighters were the ones that just got off of probation.
Yeah.
So, it's the old thing about the legacy of just carrying on what you went through.
Right.
So we actually broke the cycle by sending newly completed probationary firefighters to this training to teach them how to not harass the next generation. And it was eye-opening for them.
Right. Right.
So these are the kind of mindset trainings that we just infuse through the LAFD that have to be then, for the sake of violent encounters and use of force, PD has to infuse everywhere, and it has to be ongoing.
Right. Yeah, that's a good note to close on. I mean, one thing when I used to work as a consultant, we always used to talk about is how whenever you have a change management strategy in any organization on any topic,
right,
training's not enough.
Right.
And the reason is the culture eats strategy for lunch. I mean, that's
right.
That's the old cliche, and it's absolutely
Right.
true. And so one does have to have commitment to make long-term change.
Right.
And, I think that there's been some significant progress on that, but it's a painfully slow thing, right?
Right.
Because these issues of inequality and abuse are so deeply woven into the fabric and habits
Right.
of organizations and communities that it's just
Right.
really hard to break the cycle.
Right.
That if one is committed to it, I think that one gets to a solution. Like, it's never going to be perfect.
Right.
But incrementally improve things, and
Right.
hopefully if we get another incident in 25 years,
Yeah.
the level of community violence that'll ensue will be as much different
Right.
from then to 2020 as from 2020 to 1992.
Right.
So that
Right.
we don't end up with things burning out of control.
Right. Right.
Well, thank you so much.
It's
And
been very interesting, Niles.
yeah, and I also appreciate all the work you're doing on just the substantive side of this stuff. It's, as I say, I think the kind of community work that you've been spearheading with CAPLA, I think it's essential for why things are, have not gotten nearly as bad this time around. So thank you.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you.
All right.
Most interesting. One day when we have to go to lunch.
Yes, exactly. Nice to meet you.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks, Niles. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Ideas Matter, a podcast by the Berggruen Institute that explores some of the biggest challenges facing our societies and shaping who we are as humans. During this time of great transformations, we need new ideas and deep, long-term thinking more than ever. We invite you to join us in discovery. You can find us on social media at Berggruen Institute, and please subscribe to Noema, our new digital and print magazine, at noemamag.com.